You think you're just living your life, making choices, taking decisions, following a path that feels like your own. But what if I told you that very sense of normalcy is the trap? What if the greatest secret ever kept from humanity wasn't hidden in some classified file, in some secret room of power, but right inside you, silently operating for decades, waiting for the moment you were strong enough to realize? This isn't another conspiracy video. This isn't theory. It's not spiritual entertainment designed to make you feel special for 5 minutes before you forget all about it. What you're about to uncover here is something Gnostic philosophers were persecuted and killed for teaching, something ancient traditions tried to preserve in codes and symbols because they knew speaking openly was too dangerous, something the control structures of this reality need you to never discover about yourself. There's a spark inside you, a divine ember that doesn't belong in this world, and there are entities, forces, systems, call them what you will, that have already identified that you carry this, and they will do everything to ensure you never wake up to that fact. Have you ever felt like you don't quite belong here, like there's something more, something beyond what your eyes can see, beyond what society offers you as an answer? Have you ever had that unsettling feeling that the reality around you seems like a set, a construct, something specifically designed to keep you distracted? Have you woken up in the middle of the night with the certainty that you've been called to something you don't yet fully comprehend? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then what comes next is absolutely essential for you. The Gnostics called it the monad, Hermetic philosophy called it the one, Eastern traditions spoke of the spark of Atman. The Nag Hammadi texts describe with chilling precision how the chosen souls of the supreme light are inserted into this dense material world, into this cosmos constructed by the Archons, and how these souls carry a mark that no illusion can completely erase. And the Archons, these administrators of the material world's matrix, these guardians of the layers of illusion, they know who you are long before you do. There are 3 signs, 3 invisible marks, 3 patterns that appear in the lives of those touched by the monad. And today, in this video, you're going to understand each of them with a depth that will forever change how you see yourself. But be warned, this isn't a comfortable journey, because awakening never is. And before I show you the first sign, I need you to understand one fundamental thing about the nature of the game being played all around you, a game you've probably never even been aware of. You know that feeling when you come across information that seems like it was written specifically for you. When something resonates so deeply it feels less like a discovery and more like a recognition, as if a part of you already knew and was just waiting for confirmation. That's exactly what often happens when a chosen soul of the monad encounters the Gnostic truth for the first time. This video is for those who feel there's something more, for those who are tired of the shallow answers the world offers, for those who feel an unrest deep inside that no material achievement can truly silence. And today, together, we're going to explore the 3 signs that the oldest texts of the Gnostic tradition describe as marks of the souls carrying the spark of the primordial light, of the monad, of the one that is beyond everything. If you want to understand why your life has always felt different, why you think in ways others don't grasp, why the Archons have such a vested interest in keeping you asleep, stick around until the end, because the 3rd sign is the most revealing of all, and it's what the control structures fear most you'll recognize. If this is already hitting home, hit that like button now, because this kind of content needs to reach those who are truly ready for it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, because this is just the entrance to the rabbit hole. And drop a comment below with the word spark if you feel this conversation was made for you. I want to see how many awakened souls are watching this right now. To understand the 3 signs that you are one of the chosen of the monad, we need to go back in time, not a century, not 2. We need to dive into one of the most silenced crises in the history of human thought, an era when the search for truth about the nature of the soul and the cosmos was literally a death sentence, and when texts we now consider the most precious records of spiritual knowledge were buried in the sands of Egypt to survive. We're talking about Gnosticism, a collection of spiritual and philosophical traditions that flourished primarily between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, in the heart of the Mediterranean world, especially in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. The Gnostics weren't a homogeneous sect. There were multiple schools of thought, the Valentinians, the Sethians, the Mandaeans, the Ophites, among many others who shared a worldview radically different from anything the dominant religious thought offered. For the Gnostics, the material world was not created by the supreme, good, and perfect God. This is perhaps the most explosive idea any system of thought has ever produced in the history of Western philosophy. The cosmos we inhabit, with all its pain, all its injustice, all its density and imprisonment, was created by inferior entities. The Archons, rulers of the material world. administrators of a system not designed for your liberation, but for your containment. The monad, the absolute one, the primordial source of all light and all true knowledge, is beyond this cosmos. It is beyond the archons. It is beyond any structure you can see, touch, or measure. And within this one exists the pleroma, the fullness, the state of spiritual totality from which every genuine divine spark is an extension. But how did we get here? The Gnostic texts, especially the Apocryphon of John, one of the documents found in Nag Hammadi in 1945, describe a cosmogony, a narrative of the cosmos's origin, that is unsettling in its precision. Sophia, one of the eons of the pleroma, the divine emanations of the monad, is said to have acted rashly, generating a being without the Father's approval. This being, Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the false creator, was born incomplete, deformed in his spiritual nature, and yet unknowingly carried within him a fragment of Sophia's light. Yaldabaoth, ignorant of his own origin, looked into the void beneath the pleroma and declared, "I am a jealous god, and there is no other beside me." This phrase, recorded in Gnostic texts and eerily echoed in certain Old Testament passages, reveals the nature of the material world's creator. A being who not only created an imperfect cosmos, but actively needed the beings within that cosmos to believe there was nothing beyond him. Yaldabaoth then created the Archons, his assistants, the rulers of the planetary spheres, the layers of illusion that envelop the soul in its descent into matter. Each archontic sphere represents a layer of conditioning, of spiritual slumber, of identification with the false self. And together, Yaldabaoth and his Archons created the human being, the Anthropos, with a very specific intention: to imprison within the flesh and psyche the fragment of light that Sophia had lost. But here's where something extraordinary happened that the Archons never anticipated. When they breathed the breath of life into the Anthropos, they inadvertently transferred to it the spark of light Sophia had left within Yaldabaoth. And suddenly, the human being rose, more luminous, more spiritually powerful than any Archon could ever be. The texts describe the Archons' panic before the creature they had just made. They saw in the Anthropos' face the reflection of the divine image, of the light of the pleroma, and knew they had created something that, if it awakened to its true nature, would be free in a way they could never be. This explains, within the Gnostic system, why the world seems designed to keep us distracted. Why accumulation, consumption, empty entertainment, politics, conflicts, manufactured crises, all of it is part of a system with a very clear objective: to keep the spark dormant, to keep the light bearer mesmerized by the illusion of the material world, identified with the body, with the ego, with the structures the Archons administer. But here's the detail that changes everything. Not every human soul carries this spark of the pleroma with the same intensity. The Gnostics distinguish between the pneumatics, the spirit bearers, the psychics, the partially conscious, and the hylakoi, those completely identified with matter. And the pneumatics, the chosen of the monad, exhibit specific signs, recognizable patterns that appear in their lives in ways that cannot be explained by psychology or biology alone. And these signs aren't romanticized. They're not just beautiful, comfortable things. They are also marks of a very real spiritual struggle, a tension between the spark that wants to awaken and the system that wants to keep it asleep. If you've made it this far into the video, there's a very high probability that what comes next will resonate on layers you can't yet name, but that you recognize completely. Now imagine you live in a world where all the information that reaches you has been filtered, curated, selected, where the most important questions about the origin of consciousness, about the nature of the cosmos, about who you truly are systematically replaced by answers that suit the system. We're not talking science fiction here. We're talking about the history of humanity, and especially the history of how Gnostic knowledge was deliberately hunted down, distorted, and erased. And why so much effort? Why not simply ignore a group of spiritual philosophers who spoke of archons and pleromas? The answer lies in what Gnosticism represented to any power structure. The Gnostic needs no intermediary. The Gnostic needs no institution to mediate their relationship with the divine. The Gnostic does not accept that the creator of the material world is the pinnacle of spiritual reality. In other words, the Gnostic is fundamentally uncontrollable. Think about what that means. A human being who believes they carry within them a spark of the absolute light, who understands that the world's structures were created to imprison them, who seeks direct knowledge, gnosis, as a path to liberation. That human being does not obey out of fear. They do not submit out of ignorance. They do not buy into the ready-made answers the system offers. For any architecture of control, be it religious, political, or social, this kind of consciousness is the most serious threat that exists. And then comes what is perhaps the most impactful fact in this entire story. In December of 1945, in a place called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a peasant farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near a cliff, searching for natural fertilizer. He found a sealed clay jar. Inside it were 13 leather codices containing over 50 Gnostic texts that had been hidden in the desert around the 4th century, likely by monks who needed to protect these writings from destruction ordered by Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria, who in 367 had issued a pastoral letter demanding the destruction of all heretical books. Some guardian of knowledge, chose to bury these texts instead of destroying them. They chose to bet that one day, in the future, prepared eyes would find them. And these texts remained hidden for approximately 1600 years, right up until the moment the world began to more broadly question the structures of authority that had dominated Western thought. Among these texts are the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia in distinct versions, and documents that describe with unsettling detail the nature of the Archons, the functioning of the system for imprisoning the divine spark, and the signs by which pneumatic souls, the chosen of the monad, can be recognized. And what these texts reveal about how the Archons operate is something that once you understand it, you can't see the world the same way anymore. They don't operate through brute force. They operate through forgetfulness. The word that appears repeatedly in Gnostic texts is lethe, forgetfulness. The soul descending into the material world passes through layers of spiritual amnesia. It forgets its origin. It forgets its nature. It forgets it is a bearer of light. And then it spends its entire life building its identity upon these layers of forgetfulness, believing that the ego, the body, social roles are what it truly is. But the forgetfulness is never complete. And here's where the signs come in. Because the spark of the monad, no matter how buried it is beneath the archontic layers of conditioning, never stops trying to communicate with its bearer. And this communication appears in very specific forms that you've probably already experienced, possibly without ever having had the vocabulary to name them. You know that feeling of being in a completely different place from where you should be, not geographically, existentially. As if the world around you is a stage, and you're the only one who realizes it's a stage. That has a name in the Gnostic tradition. It has a history. And it's the first of the 3 signs. But before we get there, I need you to understand something about how the archontic control system identifies the spark bearers, because this part completely changes your relationship with the difficulties you've already faced in life. If you've made it this far and are feeling this strange recognition, this sense that you've always known something you couldn't name, I want to ask you a direct question. Have you ever felt like you're playing a game whose rules were specifically designed for you to lose? As if the obstacles in your life had a pattern, an intentionality that goes beyond mere chance. Type the word monad below if you're feeling the weight of this conversation. I want to see how many sparks are awake and watching this right now. Because what comes next, the 3 signs in detail, and especially the third, the one the Archons fear most for you to recognize within yourself is something that will require you to be completely present. And if you're feeling that this journey is yours, the next topic will be one of the most important moments you've ever had in front of a screen. The proofs of the Archon's existence and the spark of the monad aren't just in the Nag Hammadi texts. They're scattered throughout the entire history of human thought, in cultures that never had direct contact with one another, in philosophical traditions separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, all converging on the same central point with a consistency that cannot be explained as mere coincidence. Let's start with ancient Greece, because that's where we find one of the most solid philosophical pieces of evidence that the material world is an inferior construct, administered by forces that have no interest in your liberation. Plato, in the 4th century BCE, described in the myth of the cave something later Gnostics would immediately recognize as a description of archontic imprisonment. Prisoners chained from birth, unable to move their heads, seeing only shadows projected on the wall, and believing those shadows are the total reality. The philosopher who escapes the chains, who climbs to the sunlight and sees the real world, upon returning to warn the others, is ridiculed and threatened with death. Plato wasn't just crafting an educational allegory. He was precisely describing the structure of imprisoned consciousness and the true cost of awakening. And what's even more revealing is that Plato, in his dialogue Timaeus, describes the creator of the material world, the demiurge, exactly as the Gnostics would centuries later, a being who fabricates the cosmos from already existing matter, following imperfect models, producing a creation that is a distant shadow of the true real. The Greek word demiurge literally means artisan, craftsman, not supreme creator, manufacturer. Someone who works with materials they didn't create, producing objects that aren't original. Plato deliberately placed that distinction there, and the Gnostics picked it up and took it to its most radical consequences. Now go to the other side of the world. In Hinduism, especially in the traditions of Advaita Vedanta, we find the concept of Maya, the cosmic illusion that covers the true nature of reality and being. Shankara, the 8th century philosopher who systematized Advaita Vedanta, described the phenomenal cosmos as superimposed upon Brahman, the absolute reality, much like a rope in the dark can be mistaken for a snake. The appearance is real as an experience, but not as substance. And the Atman, the individual spark of consciousness, is identical to Brahman, the absolute, separated only by ignorance, by avidya, which is the exact equivalent of the archontic forgetfulness described by the Gnostics. But here's the piece of information few connect. In Sanskrit, the word for beings who administer the karma and destiny of souls in the intermediate spheres between the human and the divine includes entities called Lokapalas and Dikpalas, guardians of the directions and cosmic spheres. The structure is eerily parallel to the archons of the planetary spheres described in Gnostic texts, guardians of the layers of the cosmos that the soul must traverse to return to the source. In mystical Judaism, especially in the Kabbalah, we find the Qliphoth, the shells, the forms opposite to the Sephirot of the Tree of Life. The Qliphoth are described as the structures of existence separate from God, the husks of spiritual impurity, entities that feed on the vital energy of human beings and keep the soul imprisoned in cycles of matter and illusion. Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, describes in detail how souls carrying a higher spark of divine light are especially assailed by the Qliphoth, because they represent a threat to their dominion over the material world. And then we arrive at Hermeticism, perhaps the tradition that most directly connects Gnostic philosophy with the practical reality of the awakening soul. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of 2nd and 3rd century texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, describes with unsettling detail the soul's descent through the planetary spheres, where in each sphere it acquires a layer of conditioning, a specific psychic quality associated with each planet, covering its original nature like layers of clothing over the true body. Saturn delivers the conditioning of limitation and time. Jupiter, the ambition for power. Mars, aggression and the impulse for destruction. The Sun, the arrogance of individual identity. Venus, desire and attachment. Mercury, cunning and intellectual deceit. The Moon, bodily and instinctive conditioning. 7 layers. 7 planetary archons. 7 veils over the spark, the monad. In Gnosis, that liberating knowledge, it's precisely the process of reversing that descent, stripping away each layer, recognizing every conditioning as external to your true nature. The convergence of these traditions, Greek, Indian, Jewish, Hermetic, Gnostic, all describing parallel structures of cosmic imprisonment and an internal spark that can break free, that ain't some philosophical fluke. It's the accumulated record of consciousnesses that over millennia touched the same truth by different paths. And what makes it even more significant is that this very convergence was the most intense target of relentless campaigns to bury this knowledge throughout history. It's no accident that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. It's no accident that the Inquisition specifically hounded medieval Gnostic movements like the Cathars and Bogomils with a ferocity utterly disproportionate to their political clout. It's no accident that even today, this knowledge gets marginalized in academia, slapped with labels like superstition or pseudo-philosophy, while systems of thought that justify power hierarchies get taught as the bedrock of civilization. The most damning evidence that the archontic system is real isn't just in the texts themselves, it's in the consistent pattern of those texts being suppressed. And that pattern leads us straight to the darkest corner of this whole damn story, the one the power structures absolutely don't want you looking at too closely. There's a piece of history we need to lay out, plain as day, because without it, you can't fully grasp why the 3 signs of the monads chosen are so dangerous to control structures. Gnostic knowledge wasn't just fought theologically. It was hunted, destroyed, and replaced with a surgical precision that reveals something far more intentional than just some theological squabble between religious groups. The Cathars of southern France, in the 12th and 13th centuries, were a movement that had rediscovered the fundamentals of Gnostic thought. They believed in a supreme God of light beyond the creator of the material world, recognized the archontic nature of both ecclesiastical and secular power structures, lived with a spiritual austerity that contrasted violently with the corruption of the Church of Rome, and most importantly, didn't need any institutional middlemen to access the divine. They had their own initiates, the perfecti, the good men and good women, who carried and transmitted the knowledge of the inner spark. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, the first crusade in Christian history waged against other Christians. What followed was one of the most brutal genocides in medieval Europe. The city of Béziers, where Cathars and Catholics lived side by side, was besieged. When the Crusader soldiers asked the papal legate Arnold Amori how to distinguish heretics from the faithful so as not to kill innocents, the answer was recorded by history with a chilling indifference that still causes horror. Kill them all. God will know his own. It's estimated that between 15 and 20,000 people were massacred in a single day. Why such a disproportionate response? Why not simply banish the Cathars, exile them, confiscate their assets, as was done with so many other dissident groups? The answer lies in what Catharism represented as a structural threat. A community that taught that the material world was an imperfect creation, that institutions of power were expressions of the archontic system, and that every human being carried within them a direct divine spark that didn't need any church to be accessed. That community was simply incompatible with any architecture of control built on mediation and hierarchy. And the same pattern repeats in completely different contexts. The Bogomils in the Balkans, the Mandeans in Mesopotamia, the Yazidis and Kurdistan groups that preserved elements of Gnostic knowledge in different cultural forms all faced persecution rarely aimed at other religious groups with such intensity. And when direct persecution wasn't possible, the second archontic method of suppression kicked in: distortion. You take a dangerous idea and twist it until it's either harmless or laughable. The archons of Gnostic texts, specific beings with precise cosmological functions in the administration of soul imprisonment, were converted into generic demons from popular folklore, or worse, sci-fi movie characters nobody takes seriously. The monad, the absolute one transcending all duality, was simplified until it became unrecognizable in popular versions of New Age spirituality. And the concept of gnosis, the direct and liberating knowledge of the nature of reality, was emptied out and sold as self-help packaged in spiritual jargon. There's a third method, and maybe the most effective of all. Make the people seeking this knowledge seem crazy, dangerous, or just plain pathetic. Have you ever noticed how any serious questioning of the nature of social control gets immediately slapped with the conspiracy theory label? How any serious exploration of unofficial knowledge systems is treated with academic scorn? This mechanism ain't random. It's the modern equivalent of the Albigensian Crusade. Doesn't kill the body, kills the credibility. And in many cases, it's just as efficient. But here's the kicker, the one thing the system has never quite managed to snuff out completely: direct experience. Gnosis isn't a book that can be burned. It's not a community that can be massacred. It's a quality of perception that emerges from within the spark bearer when the conditions are right. And when it emerges, nothing in the archontic system's arsenal can make it fully retreat. You can be silenced. But you can't be unawakened. And it's precisely here that we arrive at the spiritual and philosophical heart of what we're exploring. Because understanding why the system suppresses this knowledge is only half the journey. The other half is understanding what happens inside you when the monad spark starts to move. Every great tradition of genuine wisdom in human history, regardless of culture, language, or era, converges around a fundamental paradox that is simultaneously the simplest and the hardest thing to grasp about existence. You are not what you think you are. What you think you are was constructed. And what you truly are never needed construction at all. Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic of the 13th and 14th centuries, who was investigated for heresy by Pope John 3,783,000 Sinek for Tudelquility Remengen, arguing to the Reciben one by Kamakfrites. Eckhart said that deep in the soul there is something uncreated and uncreatable, something eternal, identical to the divine essence, and that most people spend their entire lives without ever touching it because they are completely identified with the external layers of conditioning. Eckhart was almost condemned as a heretic. He died before the process was concluded, but many of his propositions were condemned posthumously. Why? Because a human being who believes they have something divine within them, who needs no institutional mediation to access that identity, is a being who cannot be controlled by fear or the promise of post-mortem reward. Vajrayana Buddhism, especially in the Tibetan traditions, speaks of Rigpa, primordial consciousness, the Buddha nature that is the basis of all experience but is usually covered by the veil of habitual mental constructs. The Dzogchen teachings, perhaps the most direct of all awakening traditions the world knows, describe the ordinary human condition precisely as the Gnostics describe archontic imprisonment. A consciousness of luminous nature, trapped in patterns of automatic reactivity that it mistakes for its real identity. And Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religious systems in the world still practiced, with roots dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE, describes a cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the principle of darkness and imprisonment. Every human being is a battlefield between these forces. And the souls who consciously choose the side of the light, who cultivate Asha, truth and cosmic order, are those who progressively dissolve the layers of Angra Mainyu's influence in their lives. The convergence is impossible to ignore. Greeks, Hindus, Buddhists, Kabbalists, Gnostics, Zoroastrians, Christian mystics all describing the same structure with different vocabularies. A spark of light imprisoned in layers of conditioning administered by forces that have an interest in maintaining that imprisonment. And a path of direct knowledge that progressively liberates that spark. If you've stuck with this video this far, if you're feeling that recognition that goes beyond mere intellectual agreement, I need to ask you something straight up. Did you already know, on some level, that there's something inside you that doesn't belong in this system? That there's a part of you that observes everything without ever being completely absorbed by anything? Hit the comments below with a yes or no. I really want to know what you're feeling right now, because the answer to that question is more important than it seems. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Hit that button below and ding the bell, because what's coming next to 3 signs in detail, and especially what all of it means for your practical journey right now, that's what you came looking for in this video from the jump. I want you to stop for a moment, not metaphorically, literally. If you're watching this while doing something else, washing dishes, driving, or scrolling through a feed in another tab, I need you to give your full attention to what's coming next, because this part isn't information. It's a mirror. And mirrors only work when you stand in front of them. Think about your life so far. Not the external events, not the triumphs or the failures, not what you've accumulated or lost. Think about the patterns, the repeating cycles, the sensations that always show up in the same kinds of situations. The specific quality of your restlessness, the kind that doesn't disappear after a good night's sleep, that isn't resolved by a promotion at work, that reappears in the silence between one distraction and another. There's a question that the Gnostic philosopher Valentinus, one of the greatest thinkers of the 2nd century, placed at the center of his entire teaching system. It wasn't a question about God. It wasn't a question about the cosmos. It was a question he considered the most urgent any human being could ask. The question was this: what moves me when nobody's watching? Because the Archons within the Gnostic system don't just operate through external structures of social, economic, and religious control. They operate through internal automatic behaviors, through fears that have never been examined, through desires that have never been questioned, through identities built to satisfy expectations that weren't even yours to begin with. You were conditioned to want certain things, to fear others, to define your worth in particular ways, long before you had enough awareness to choose whether you wanted that conditioning. And the spark bearer of the monad, the chosen one the Archons have already ID'd, feels this layer of conditioning differently than most people do. It feels like a suit that doesn't fit. A role assigned without an audition. A script someone else wrote for a life that ain't quite yours. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a situation that technically should make you happy, that had all the elements you were taught to desire, and yet felt a strange emptiness, an absence of something you couldn't quite name? That emptiness isn't a pathology. It ain't ingratitude. It's the most honest signal the monad spark can send. It's it telling you that what was built around you, no matter how sophisticated, isn't what it came looking for in this existence. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel, in a famous essay titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" argued that there's a quality of subjective experience that can never be completely captured by any external objective description. There's a what it's like to be you that is irreducible to neurons, to social history, to cultural conditioning. Nagel wasn't a Gnostic. He was a rigorous analytic philosopher, but he was touching precisely the same territory that the Gnostics called pneuma, the dimension of experience that belongs to the spark and that no control system can fully map. And this irreducibility is precisely what makes you a threat to the archontic system. You can be categorized demographically, algorithmized, statistically predicted in 1,000 behaviors. But there's a point in your consciousness that remains opaque to any external mapping system. One that observes without being observed. That knows without needing to learn. That stays calm at the center of any storm if you can just find it. Contemplatives of all traditions call this point by different names. The Gnostics called it pneuma. The Buddhists called it rigpa. The Christian mystics called it the ground of the soul. The Vedantins called it sakshi, the pure witness. The Taoists called it the unnameable, yet the source of all. Different vocabularies for the same direct experience. And that experience, when genuinely touched, produces an effect that no substance, no accomplishment, no relationship can produce on its own. A clarity that doesn't depend on anything external to exist. Now I want you to do something that might seem simple but will be more revealing than hours of philosophical reading. Ask yourself with real honesty, without the answer you think you should give. Who am I when I strip away all the roles I play? When I take off the professional role, the family role, the social role, the political identity, the cultural preferences, the formed opinions, what's left? What observes while all of that is being stripped away? If that question sparks a strange lightness in you, a kind of silent recognition, you're tapping into the right current. If it sparks anxiety, an impulse to quickly fill that space with some definition, you're feeling archontic resistance in real time. The system doesn't want you in that quiet, empty space. Because in that space, the monad spark is recognizable. And what is recognized can no longer be completely controlled by forgetfulness. This reflection isn't an intellectual exercise. It's the beginning of a practice that, when taken seriously, changes the texture of every moment of your life. And it's precisely about that practice that we need to talk now, because knowledge that doesn't transform your daily grind is just another layer of intellectual identification. And the monad spark deserves far more than that. The question that naturally bubbles up after everything we've explored in this video is this. Okay, I get the Gnostic system, I recognize the Archons, I feel the monad spark inside me. But what do I do with it on a Tuesday morning when I've got bills to pay, a tough boss to deal with, complicated relationships to navigate, and a concrete material world to survive in, regardless of any cosmology? That's the most honest question there is. And the Gnostics' answer, especially the Valentinians, wasn't escapism. It wasn't about ditching the world and retreating to a cave. It was something far more radical, far more applicable. It was about changing your relationship with the world without necessarily changing the world itself. The first practical step is what the Gnostics called recognition. In Greek, anagnorisis. It's not intellectual analysis. It's direct perception of when you're operating from the spark or from archontic conditioning. And the distinction is simpler than it seems. When you react automatically, no space between stimulus and response, when a situation triggers a habitual pattern that kicks in before any conscious choice, you're operating in archontic mode. When there's a moment, even a fleeting one, of observation before the response, when you notice the pattern before you get dragged along by it, the spark is active. This isn't a permanent accomplishment you make once and keep forever. It's a practice that renews itself in every moment. And the good news is that any moment serves as an entry point. Road rage, anxiety before a tough conversation, the impulse to check your phone for the 55th time in a day. Each of these moments is an opportunity to notice the archontic pattern in operation and to hit pause. Not to suppress the pattern, but to see it clearly. The second step is what the Hermetic traditions called separation. The ability to distinguish what belongs to your essential nature from what has been overlaid by conditioning. This demands brutal honesty. A lot of what you call just the way I am are actually patterns installed long before you had the awareness to choose them. The specific fear that paralyzes you in certain situations. The need for approval that warps your choices. The pattern of sabotaging what matters when it gets too close. These aren't your nature, they're archontic layers. And they can be seen as such. The third step, and maybe the most transformative in practical life, is cultivating what the Gnostics called living gnosis, knowledge that emerges from direct experience as opposed to knowledge that comes from external authorities. This means developing the capacity to ask, in any situation, what does the spark in me recognize as true here? Not what fear says. Not what the need for approval says. Not what cultural conditioning says. What does the quietest, clearest point within you recognize? This doesn't produce cheap certainties. In fact, it produces the opposite. It produces a comfortable willingness to not know, to remain in open questions, to resist the temptation to collapse the complexity of reality into simple answers that satisfy the ego but not the spark. And this willingness, over time, builds a type of wisdom that is recognizable in any being who genuinely practices it. A presence. A lightness. A capacity to be fully in the world without being fully of the world. Carl Gustav Jung, who deeply studied Gnostic texts and integrated them into his system of analytical psychology, coined the concept of individuation to describe the process by which a person progressively distinguishes the true self from the layers of persona, shadow, and collective conditioning that cover their essential nature. Jung didn't use the language of archons, but the process he described is structurally identical to what the Gnostics called the progressive liberation of the pneumatic spark. And Jung was explicit about the cost of that process. It's not comfortable. It's the most serious work a human being can undertake. But it's also the only work that produces what he called completeness, and what the Gnostics called the return to the pleroma. The fourth practical step is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all for anyone living in a culture that's all about speed and churning out results. It's about the deliberate cultivation of silence, not just the absence of noise. I'm talking inner silence, that space between one thought and the next, the beat between one move and the one that follows. Because that's where the spark of the monad, that original fire, becomes clearest. The Archons, they thrive on the noise, the constant chatter, the impossibility of ever truly shutting up. A life crammed full of external stimuli is a life where that spark rarely gets a chance to even whisper over the din of what we're told to be. So, set aside some time every day, even if it's just 10 minutes, to just sit. No agenda, no right way to meditate, no reaching for some special state. Just sit and watch what comes up. Thoughts, feelings, urges, old memories, they're all going to surface. And the practice is simply not to automatically chase any of them down. Observe without attaching. Let it pass without trying to shut it down. And slowly but surely, beneath the constant current of conditioning, that quiet space that's always been there, it starts to become more recognizable, more reachable, more real than any thought just passing through it. Because when you boil it all down, everything we've talked about in this video, the whole Gnostic cosmology, the saga of the Archons and the monad, all those philosophical and spiritual parallels from traditions across the globe, it all points to one stark, practical truth. You've got something inside you that no control system, over millennia of trying, has ever managed to snuff out. And the only move you need to make is to stop looking for it out there and start recognizing it right where it's always been. You made it this far, and that's no small feat. Most folks who started this video, they bailed long ago, pulled away by the next piece of content, the next shiny distraction, the next play from the archontic system designed to keep your attention fragmented and that spark asleep. But you stuck around. And that tells me something about who you are. Throughout this video, we've walked through the entire framework of Gnostic thought on the monad and the Archons. We got a grip on how the spark of the primal light got trapped in the material world by the demiurge and his puppet masters. We saw how that same truth was held onto in traditions across the globe, only to be systematically stomped out by any power structure that needed sleeping souls to survive. And we dug into how the three signs of the monad's chosen manifest in real life, and what to actually do with that recognition in a practical, game-changing way. If this video cracked something open for you, if it sparked that quiet recognition that goes deeper than just intellectual agreement, then hit that like button right now. That simple move helps this channel immensely, keeps us bringing this kind of content to those who are genuinely ready for it. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what's coming next on this channel ties directly into what we just dove into, and you definitely don't want to miss that. And for those of you who stuck with this video all the way to the end, I want to see you in the comments. Drop the phrase IAMT Spark down there. I'm looking for the warriors who rode this out, the souls awake enough to truly recognize what's been laid out here. Your presence in those comments matters more than you might think. And check out the video popping up on your screen right now. It's directly linked to what we just covered, and it's going to take you to the next level of what we've been exploring. Don't miss it.